The Resonance Matrix Volume 3 Episode 2 Sensation, When the Body Speaks Again. Hello, and welcome to the Resonance Matrix, the Mirror Linguistic Hypothesis Series, Volume 3, Silencing the Field, Return to Self, and Episode 2 Sensation, When the Body Speaks Again. In the previous episode, we did not seek clarity, we did not pursue meaning, we did not attempt to resolve anything, we stopped, not as an act of discipline, not as a practice, but as a biological shift, the moment when movement was no longer required to stay safe. Stillness was not presented as peace. It was presented as permission. Permission for the nervous system to stand down from urgency. Permission for vigilance to loosen without being replaced. Permission for the body to realize that the environment no longer demanded an immediate response. And when that permission is granted, even briefly, something else begins to happen. Not insight, not emotion, not narrative, but sensation. This episode begins at that threshold. Sensation is often misunderstood because it does not behave the way the mind expects it to. It does not arrive with explanations. It does not present itself as an improvement. It does not follow the timeline of recovery stories or therapeutic arcs. Sensation is not here to make sense. It is here to report. When the body has been under prolonged pressure, relational, environmental, linguistic, or systemic, sensation is often the first thing to be muted, not intentionally, not consciously, but efficiently. Feeling too much too early under unsafe conditions would have overwhelmed the system, so the body learned to register less. Less contact, less texture, less internal noise, and in many cases, that numbing was not experienced as loss, it was experienced as a function. Productivity increased, thinking sharpened, action became easier. Sensation, after all, can slow things down, but now after stillness, the conditions have changed. The system is no longer in override. The field is quieter. Urgency has loosened its grip, and sensation, which never disappeared, begins to test the space again, not dramatically, not all at once, but tentatively. This is where many people become confused. They expect sensation to arrive as emotion, as catharsis, as a release, as something meaningful or even beautiful. But sensation does not perform. It does not reassure. It does not care whether it is welcomed or understood. It simply checks whether it is allowed. This episode is not about chasing sensation. It is not about amplifying feeling. It is not about embodiment as a technique. It is about recognizing that sensation returns on its own terms when the body believes it no longer needs to stay ahead of experience. Sensation is not something you generate. It is something you stop blocking, and this is why sensation often arrives in ways that feel inconvenient, subtle, or easily dismissed. A vague pressure in the chest, a warmth that has no story, a heaviness in the limbs, a flicker of discomfort without cause, a sense of movement beneath stillness. The mind often rushes in at this point, eager to interpret, to decide whether this sensation is good or bad, relevant or irrelevant, progress or regression. But interpretation is not required yet. This episode asks for something quieter, orientation, not analysis. Contact, not commentary. Presence, not performance. Within the framework of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, sensation represents the moment before language resumes its regulatory role. It is the pre-verbal signal, the body's first confirmation that it can once again register experience without immediately translating it into action or defense. When language dominated, sensation was edited. When pressure dominated, sensation was delayed. Now, as the field softens, sensation steps forward again, not asking to be named, but asking not to be rushed. This is an important distinction. Sensation is not here to tell you who you are. It is not here to explain what happened. It is not here to instruct you on what to do next. Sensation is here to restore contact. Contact with the body as it is. Contact with the present moment without urgency. Contact with internal signals that were once overridden by survival logic. For many, this can be disorienting. Sensation without narrative can feel like emptiness. Sensation without emotion can feel flat. Sensation without instruction can feel pointless. But this is not a failure of perception. It is a transition in function. The nervous system is shifting from reactive interpretation to direct registration, from meaning-making to signal receiving, from urgency to contact, and that shift requires patience, not as a virtue, but as a condition. This episode does not ask you to focus inward. It does not ask you to monitor your body. It does not ask you to generate awareness. It simply invites you to notice that sensation often returns before you feel ready for it, and long before you know what to do with it. That is not a mistake. Sensation does not wait for confidence. It waits for safety, and safety in this context does not mean comfort. It means the absence of demand, the absence of evaluation, the absence of immediate consequence. When nothing is required of sensation, it begins to speak, quietly, briefly, sometimes inconsistently. This episode will not decode sensation. It will not catalog feelings. It will not convert the body into data. It will stay close to the threshold where sensation first becomes noticeable again, and remain there long enough for the nervous system to recognize that nothing bad happens when feeling returns. From this place, later stages of the arc become possible. Orientation cannot stabilize without sensation. Discernment cannot form without a signal. A boundary cannot emerge without a felt edge. Voice cannot return without internal contact, and agency cannot exist without bodily consent. Sensation is the hinge, and because it is the hinge, it is fragile when rushed. So this episode moves slowly. It stays low. It avoids conclusions. It does not reward intensity. It does not punish numbness. It does not demand progress. It recognizes that the body speaks again only when it believes it will not be forced to justify itself. As you listen, you may notice sensations arise or not. You may notice boredom, distraction, impatience, or even a desire to skip ahead. All of these are signals too. They are not obstacles. They are part of the re-entry. There is nothing to do with them. Just let them exist. Sensation does not ask for trust. It asks for time, and that is where this episode begins. Not with answers, not with feeling, but with the quiet reappearance of contact before language, before meaning, before action resumes. Now we will move into the next section, where sensation is allowed to flicker into awareness without being captured. The first report from a body that no longer needs to disappear to survive. Atmospheric hook, the first flicker sensation, does not arrive like a message. It arrives like a question that doesn't yet have words to answer. After long periods of pressure, the body does not rush back into contact. It does not flood awareness with feeling, emotion, or clarity. That would be unsafe. That would assume too much too soon. Instead, sensation returns the way an animal tests unfamiliar ground, with one cautious step, then stillness again. A flicker, so small it could be dismissed as imagination, so brief it could be overridden by thought, so inconvenient it barely registers as relevant. This is how the nervous system checks whether it is welcome, not by asking, not by announcing, but by sending something barely noticeable and watching what happens next. A faint heaviness behind the eyes, a dull warmth in the chest that doesn't resolve into emotion, a sense of pressure in the abdomen without hunger or pain, a moment where the breath drops lower than usual, then rises again quickly, as if unsure. These are not symptoms, they are probes. The body is not trying to communicate meaning yet. It is not delivering insight. It is testing whether contact is safe without consequence. Under pressure, sensation had consequences. Feeling meant reaction. Feeling meant explanation. Feeling meant performance, defense, or correction. So the nervous system learned to feel less, not because it was broken, but because it was efficient. Now, in the absence of urgency, sensation begins to return, but it does not trust the environment yet. And by environment, we do not mean the external world alone. We mean you, your habits of interpretation, your reflex to analyze, your tendency to name, categorize, improve, or move away. Sensation does not want to be used. It wants to be allowed. This is why the first stirrings after numbness often feel unsatisfying. They are not dramatic enough to justify attention. They do not fit familiar emotional categories. They don't resolve into relief or clarity. They just exist briefly and then fade. The mind, trained for urgency, often responds with disappointment. That's it. I don't feel anything. This isn't working. I should feel more by now. But these thoughts are not failures of sensation. They are echoes of pressure. The nervous system does not return sensation where it anticipates being judged. So it sends a flicker and waits. If the flicker is ignored, overridden, or immediately interpreted, sensation withdraws again. Not as punishment, as information. Still not safe. Still too fast. Still outcome-oriented. If the flicker is noticed without grasping, if it is allowed to pass without being named or acted upon, the system learns something else. Nothing bad happened. Nothing was demanded. Nothing escalated, and next time, sensation may linger a little longer. This is the rhythm of re-entry. Not linear, not progressive, but responsive. Many people misinterpret this phase because it does not feel like healing. It feels like an inconvenience. Sensation interrupts thought. It arrives at awkward moments. It fades before you can make sense of it, and that is precisely the point. Sensation is not here to restore productivity. It is here to restore contact. Contact does not optimize. Contact does not perform. Contact does not justify itself. Contact simply happens when the system believes it will not be coerced into meaning. This is why sensation often appears first in neutral or ambiguous forms. Not pleasure, not pain, not sadness or joy, but texture, density, temperature, subtle movement, and weight. These are the most basic registers of embodied experience, the ones least likely to trigger story. And the story, at this stage, would be premature. A story brings implications. An implication brings consequence, and consequence reactivates vigilance. So the nervous system chooses sensations that carry no obvious instruction. A vague tightness that doesn't require fixing. A softness that doesn't promise safety. A stillness within stillness that doesn't demand interpretation. This can feel unsettling to those accustomed to emotional clarity or cognitive frameworks. It can feel like emptiness, or like something missing. But emptiness is not the absence of self. It is the absence of threat. When the threat recedes, the nervous system does not celebrate. It rests, and rest does not announce itself as pleasure. It announces itself as if nothing is happening, which is often misread as failure. But from a biological perspective, nothing happening is the most meaningful signal of all. It means the system no longer needs to stay ahead of experience. The first flicker of sensation often appears and disappears without explanation. You may not even be sure whether it happened. That uncertainty is part of the test. If you chase it, it retreats. If you dismiss it, it waits. If you allow it without interest, without indifference, it learns. This is why sensation returns unpredictably, not on cue, not during practice, not when you are ready, but while washing dishes, while staring out a window, while walking without purpose, while lying awake without thought. Sensation chooses moments where it is least likely to be managed, because management is what it is testing for, and this is the quiet intelligence of the body. It knows that sensation cannot fully return until it no longer needs to justify itself. The nervous system does not want reassurance. It wants non-interference. The first flicker is not a message, it is a boundary. A boundary that says, will you let this exist without doing anything to it? If the answer is yes, even unintentionally, sensation becomes less cautious. It may return later slightly stronger, slightly clearer, slightly more present, not because you invited it, but because you did not interrupt it. This section is not asking you to look for sensation. Looking is already too active. It is asking you to notice when sensation looks for you, and whether it finds a space where it can land without being taken over. Sensation does not announce itself. It checks whether it's welcome, and welcome, in this context, does not mean attention. It means the absence of demand. In the next section, we will explore why the nervous system behaves this way, why sensation tests the environment before re-entering experience, and how this cautious return is not fragility, but intelligence shaped by survival. The absence of sensation is not a failure. It is often the body still deciding, and the decision here is not cognitive. It is cellular, it takes time, and sensation knows exactly how much. The etymology and definition of sensation. What sensation actually is before we go further, one thing matters. What may have begun to stir in the previous section was not emotion, not insight, and not meaning. It was something earlier than all of that, something quieter, something that does not arrive with a story attached. If it felt vague, inconvenient, or difficult to describe, that is not a failure of attention, it is a clue. In this section we slow down just enough to clarify what sensation actually is, not to explain it away, not to analyze it, and not to turn it into something useful, but to protect it from being misnamed before it has had the chance to settle. Sensation is one of the most misunderstood experiences in modern culture precisely because it is the least dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not argue for relevance. It does not conclude. It arrives as raw data, pre-verbal, pre-emotional, and often pre-interesting. Because we live in systems that prioritize interpretation, action, and productivity, sensation is frequently skipped, overwritten, or confused for something else. To understand sensation clearly, we must first separate it from the layers that usually sit on top of it. Emotion is what happens when sensation is interpreted through memory, meaning, and context. Fear, sadness, joy, and anger are not sensations. They are organized responses to sensation. Thought is what happens when sensation and emotion are translated into narrative. The mind attempts to explain, predict, or resolve what the body has already registered. Sensation itself comes before both. It is the body's first report that something is happening, or just as importantly, that it is safe enough for something to happen. This distinction matters more than it appears to at first glance. Many people believe they have lost access to sensation because they feel numb, flat, or emotionally muted. But in most cases, sensation has not disappeared. It has simply been overridden so consistently that it no longer rises above the threshold of attention. In other words, sensation has learned that it is not welcome. From a biological perspective, sensation is not designed to entertain you. It is designed to orient you. Long before language evolved, long before reflective thought, long before social meaning, the nervous system relied on sensation as its primary interface with reality. Warmth, pressure, tightness, expansion, vibration, stillness. These are not metaphors. They are signals. Sensation is the nervous system's way of reporting state, not meaning. It tells you how the system is organized in relation to the environment, not what that organization means. Meaning comes later. This is why naming sensation too early reshapes it. The moment a sensation is labeled as anxiety, boredom, sadness, or calm, it is no longer just a sensation. It has been pulled into a cognitive and emotional frame. That frame may be accurate later, but early naming collapses the possibility before the signal has stabilized. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this is a critical point. Language does not simply describe experience. It feeds back into the nervous system and alters how experience is registered. Words mirror the state, but they also modify it. When sensation is named prematurely, the mirror closes too fast. This is one of the reasons sensation often retreats in people who are highly self-aware, reflective, or verbally skilled. The moment something stirs, the mind steps in to interpret, classify, or resolve it. The nervous system learns quickly that the raw signal will be immediately recruited into meaning, and so it dampens its output, not because it is broken, but because it is adaptive. Historically, many philosophical and spiritual traditions recognize this distinction intuitively, even if they use different language. In early contemplative traditions, sensation was often referred to as the first movement, not a movement toward action, but a movement toward awareness. In these frameworks, sensation was not treated as something to be understood, but something to be allowed. It was considered a threshold experience, the point at which the organism re-enters contact with itself after periods of defense, dissociation, or collapse. Modern psychology, particularly in its early cognitive behavioral forms, often collapsed sensation and emotion into a single category. What mattered was the interpretation and the response. Sensation became invisible, useful only insofar as it triggered thought or behavior. The result is a culture fluent in explanation but poor in perception. People become highly skilled at narrating how they feel while remaining disconnected from the raw data of feeling itself. They can describe stress without noticing tension. They can discuss fear without registering contraction. They can analyze trauma without sensing the body's attempt to thaw. Volume 3 exists precisely to reverse that order. Sensation is not a step toward emotion. It is a step toward trust. This brings us to the working definition that will guide this episode and the series that follows. Sensation is the body's first report that it is safe enough to register experience. This definition reframes sensation entirely. It moves sensation out of the realm of intensity and into the realm of permission. Sensation does not emerge because something dramatic has happened. It emerges because something defensive has stopped happening. When the nervous system has been under prolonged pressure, whether relational, cultural, systemic, or internal, it prioritizes survival over registration. Attention narrows, output becomes task-focused, internal states are compressed or muted. This is not pathology, it is efficiency under threat. Stillness, as explored in the previous section, creates the conditions for that efficiency to relax. But relaxation alone does not immediately produce clarity. Often it produces something far less satisfying, a vague sensation without meaning. This is where many people abandon the process. They expect relief to feel good, but instead it feels flat. They expect stillness to feel peaceful, but instead it feels empty. They expect reconnection to feel emotional, but instead it feels dull or confusing. What they are encountering is not failure. It is sensation re-emerging before interpretation has caught up. Sensation is often inconvenient because it does not align with expectations. It may feel small. It may feel boring. It may feel difficult to locate. It may appear and disappear quickly, as if testing whether it will be tolerated. This testing is not metaphorical. Neurobiologically, the nervous system updates its predictions based on outcome. If registering internal states leads to overwhelm, conflict, or collapse, those states are suppressed. If registering internal states leads to safety, neutrality, or non-interference, they are allowed to continue. This is why sensation checks whether it is welcome. The body does not need encouragement. It needs non-interruption. Another reason sensation is often confused with emotion is that emotion is more socially legible. Emotions have names. They can be shared. They can be justified. Sensation does not offer that immediately. It exists without explanation. In many environments, especially those shaped by productivity, performance, or emotional literacy cultures, raw sensation has no obvious place. There is nothing to do with it, no action to take, no insight to extract, so it is dismissed. Yet sensation is the foundation of all later regulation. Without sensation, emotion becomes performative, thought becomes detached, choice becomes reactive. Sensation is not about intensity, it is about accuracy. Within MLH field theory, sensation can be understood as the first coherent signal within the field, a signal that has not yet been distorted by language expectation or relational demand. It is the body's way of saying, this is where I am now, not where I should be, not what this means, not what comes next, just here. This is why sensation is so central to the return to self arc of Volume 3. Before boundaries can be felt, sensation must be registered. Before discernment can operate, sensation must be trusted. Before voice can emerge without performance, sensation must stabilize as a reliable reference point. If Volume 2 mapped how sensation was overridden, Volume 3 begins by allowing it to return without immediately assigning it a job. It is important to state explicitly what sensation is not. Sensation is not mindfulness as a technique. It is not scanning the body for problems. It is not seeking insight. It is not producing calm. Sensation is contact, and contact after long periods of override can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, not because it is dangerous, but because the nervous system has been oriented outward for so long that inward registration feels undefined. This is why sensation often arrives as quiet curiosity rather than clarity, a small warmth, a subtle pressure, a sense of something shifting without direction. These are signs of thaw, not confusion. From a developmental perspective, sensation is also where self-trust begins. Infants do not begin with language or emotion as we understand them. They begin with sensation. Through consistent, safe mirroring, sensation becomes associated with meaning, and meaning becomes associated with agency. When that process is disrupted through neglect, pressure, or systemic override, the return does not begin with meaning. It begins with sensation reappearing without interpretation. This is not regression, it is resequencing. The task of this episode is not to teach you how to feel. It is to remove the cultural and cognitive obstacles that make feeling unsafe or unnecessary. By clarifying what sensation actually is, We protect it from being collapsed into something else. We allow it to exist without demand. In the next section, we will explore what happens cognitively when sensation begins to return, why the mind often tries to restart urgency, productivity, or movement, and why that impulse is not a problem but a transitional reflex. Sensation does not need to be strong to be real. It does not need to make sense to be valid, and it does not need to lead anywhere to matter. It is simply the body's first quiet signal that it no longer needs to stay silent to survive. But here we keep the roll clean. This section exists to remove one reflex, the reflex to interpret immediately, because the return to self does not begin with understanding. It begins with the smallest, quietest revolution, letting sensation exist without being turned into anything. The cognitive shift from interpreting to allowing. When sensation returns after periods of numbness, the mind rarely receives it quietly. It treats sensation as a message that must be decoded. It treats feeling as a problem requiring explanation. It treats the internal signal as something that must immediately become meaningful. This is not failure, it is conditioning. Most modern environments train the mind to believe that unlabeled experience is unsafe. Ambiguity is treated as a threat. Uncertainty is treated as error. And so when sensation reappears, vague, undefined, preverbal, the mind moves quickly to interpret. This section explores the second cognitive shift of Volume 3, the movement from interpreting sensation to allowing sensation. This shift may sound philosophical, but it reflects a measurable transition in how the nervous system assigns confidence to internal signals. It changes what the brain treats as actionable information. It alters breathing, posture, attention, muscle tone, and anticipatory chemistry. Interpretation regulates experience, but it can also distort it. It can soothe sensation, but it can also suppress it. To understand why sensation often feels confusing or overwhelming at first, it helps to observe what happens in sequence, not as abstract theory, but as lived neurobiology. The body generates a signal before the mind generates meaning. Sensation begins as raw physiological input. Changes in heart rhythm, shifts in gut activity, variations in muscle tone, temperature fluctuations, subtle tensions, tingling, heaviness, or pressure. Much of this is not initially experienced as conscious feeling. It first appears as interoceptive data, internal sensory information processed continuously below awareness. Contemporary neuroscience increasingly describes the brain not primarily as a reactive organ, but as a predictive regulatory system. Rather than waiting for events, it models internal bodily states and adjusts them in anticipation of need, a process often described through frameworks such as allostasis and active inference. From this perspective, sensation is not simply the body speaking. It is the brain-body system reopening channels of awareness that may have been dampened during prolonged survival adaptation. What is experienced consciously, as I feel something, represents the final stage of a long regulatory chain, the moment when an internal signal is permitted into awareness. The brain compares the incoming signal with a prediction. Internal experience emerges through an interaction between expectation and sensation. Predictive processing models propose that the brain constantly compares incoming sensory data with prior predictions. It updates either the model or the interpretation based on the mismatch, which researchers describe as prediction error. When a person has lived within urgency, pressure, chronic productivity, or emotional override, predictive models often become biased towards suppression and functional output. The system learns prioritization rules such as remain useful, ignore internal signal, do not slow down, do not feel what interferes with action. When sensation begins to return, particularly in stillness, it collides with models designed for survival through motion. The resulting mismatch often appears subjectively as confusion. The confusion does not indicate incoherent sensation. It reflects a conflict between the new signal and the old prediction. This reframes the experience significantly. Confusion is often a prediction conflict, not personal weakness. The mind categorizes to create closure. Once sensation enters awareness, the mind attempts to name it. This impulse toward categorization is fundamental to human cognition. Rapid classification allows faster decision-making and reduces uncertainty. Research in emotion construction suggests that the brain uses interoceptive inputs alongside concepts and context to generate experience. Meaning is not always added later. Meaning often arises immediately through categorization, and categorization regulates the nervous system. The moment sensation receives a label, uncertainty decreases. The system experiences a brief sense of control. Now I know what this is. But closure can arrive prematurely. Within the framework of the resonance matrix, early interpretation often converts raw sensation into narrative forms. Insight, this means something about me. Diagnosis, this is anxiety. Story, this comes from the past. Identity, this is who I am. None of these is inherently inaccurate. But when they emerge too quickly, they override the signal before it stabilizes. Because Volume 3 concerns the restoration of internal reference, sensation must be allowed to become reliable before it becomes meaningful. Language reshapes physiological experience. Language does not merely describe sensation. It feeds back into the nervous system. Within the mirror-linguistic hypothesis, language functions as a regulatory mirror. Words reflect the internal state of the body and brain, influencing future organization. Once a sensation is named, the body begins adapting to that description. A vague internal flutter, labeled as panic, recruits threat physiology. Breathing tightens, attention narrows, muscles brace. The same sensation labeled differently produces different regulation. Language, therefore, participates in shaping experience rather than simply observing it. For this reason, a core principle emerges: sensation precedes language. Naming too early reshapes the signal. The cognitive shift explored here involves tolerating the pre-language phase, allowing sensation to remain unresolved long enough to stabilize. Allowing is a physiological condition. Allowing is often misunderstood as passive acceptance or a philosophical attitude. In practice, allowing represents a specific nervous system state. It is the capacity to remain present without immediate correction. Allowing involves noticing sensation without compressing it into certainty, without demanding explanation, and without forcing action. It requires tolerating uncertainty long enough for predictive models to update. This process reflects fundamental mechanisms of neuroplastic change. Repeated experiences of safe contact with sensation alter prior expectations. The nervous system learns that registration does not produce harm. Research exploring contemplative and attention training practices frequently examines related processes, particularly changes in interoceptive awareness and regulation outcomes. Evidence suggests that directing attention toward internal states can influence subjective experience and emotional regulation in certain contexts. At the same time, the scientific landscape remains complex. Measures of interoception vary widely, and self-report does not always correspond to physiological accuracy. Mechanistic explanations continue to evolve. This uncertainty does not weaken the investigation. It strengthens it. The resonance matrix does not propose doctrine. It examines experience. The essential observation remains: sensation does not require understanding. It requires permission. Permission here means the nervous system learning that registration carries no consequence. The nervous system tests safety before reopening. The return of sensation rarely occurs suddenly or completely. It often emerges gradually, small fragments of experience appearing and disappearing. This process can be understood through the concept of neuroception, the nervous system's capacity to detect cues of safety and threat outside conscious awareness. While influential in clinical contexts, theoretical models of neuroception remain debated, and interpretations vary across disciplines. Used as a lens rather than a doctrine, the concept illustrates an observable phenomenon. The system reopens only when sufficient safety is detected. A spontaneous sigh, a brief warmth, a tremor that fades when examined. These are not malfunctions, they are safety tests. The body and brain evaluate whether the environment, internal and external, can support renewed contact. Interpretation can become another form of control. The impulse to interpret often reflects a deeper drive for control. Modern culture rewards explanation. Insight appears intelligent. Diagnosis appears responsible. Narrative appears coherent. But sensation is not a story, it is information. Immediate interpretation frequently activates survival responses: fixing, attempting to remove the sensation, justifying, explaining its cause, and performing, shaping it for social acceptance. Each response increases cognitive load and teaches the nervous system that sensation is a problem, rather than a signal. Sensation itself is rarely overwhelming. The demand for meaning often amplifies it. A small physical tension becomes a narrative. The narrative recruits anxiety. Anxiety recruits physiology. The experience intensifies, appearing as if sensation caused the escalation when interpretation initiated it. Volume 3 reverses this process, not by rejecting thought, but by restoring accuracy. Allowing rebuilds internal reference. Volume 2 explored how external influence overrides autonomy. Volume 3 traces how autonomy returns through internal reference. Internal reference does not return through better thinking. It returns through reliable sensing. Allowing sensation provides the conditions for this reliability. The nervous system updates its expectations through repeated safe contact. Sensation does not always signal danger. Registration does not require action. Discomfort does not demand narrative. Experience can occur without urgency. This is neuroplastic learning expressed in human terms. The system reorganizes through experience rather than instruction. Allowing, therefore, functions as a bridge, the transition from raw signal to trust. The mind no longer suppresses sensation. It protects space for sensation to appear. Having explored the cognitive dimension of allowing, attention now turns to the body itself. The next section maps the physiological processes through which sensation stabilizes: the breath shifting, muscles releasing, micro-movements emerging, and autonomic patterns recalibrating without force. If the cognitive shift creates permission, the somatic blueprint reveals what the body does with it. The somatic blueprint, thawing without movement stillness, is not the absence of activity. It is the moment the body stops preparing. When a system has lived under prolonged pressure, emotional, relational, economic, or existential, it does not rest simply because the pressure ends. Survival states have momentum. Muscles hold memory. Breath patterns retain history. Vigilance does not dissolve on command. It waits for evidence. This is why stillness, when it first arrives, rarely feels peaceful. It feels unfamiliar. The body does not yet trust the quiet. It listens to it. What unfolds in this phase is not collapse, and not relaxation in the conventional sense. It is something more precise, permission without instruction. The nervous system begins to recalibrate not because it is told to, but because nothing is demanding that it remain armored. From the outside, very little appears to happen. From the inside, the system is renegotiating decades of patterning. The first sign of thaw is often subtle enough to be missed. A breath that deepens without effort, a jaw that loosens when no one is watching, a shoulder that drops a few millimeters and stays there. These are not actions, they are releases. They happen by intention. This is an important distinction because many people confuse thawing with doing. Stretching, breathing exercises, and movement practices all of these can be supportive later. But at this stage, the body is not asking to be guided. It is asking to be left alone long enough to respond. In resonance matrix terms, this is the system exiting command-based regulation and re-entering self-regulation. Neurobiologically, what is happening here is a gradual shift in autonomic balance. Not a flip, not a reset, a drift. When the system has been held in freeze, collapse, or chronic sympathetic mobilization, parasympathetic re-entry does not announce itself with relief. It announces itself with uncertainty. The body has learned that stillness once preceded danger, punishment, abandonment, or overwhelm. So when stillness arrives now, the system checks for consequence. Only when no consequence follows does thawing continue. This is why stillness must not be forced. Forced stillness feels like restraint. Permitted stillness feels like safety testing. And safety testing takes time. As thawing continues, the body begins to unguard in layers. Large muscles soften first. Smaller stabilizing muscles follow. Then deeper postural holding begins to release, often unevenly, often asymmetrically. People sometimes report subtle tremors, microshakes, or involuntary sighs. These are not signs of instability. They are signs of discharge, the nervous system releasing held activation without story. Modern culture often pathologizes these responses. Historically and cross-culturally, they were understood as normal transitions out of threat. Many somatic traditions, from early trauma physiology to contemplative practices, recognize that the body completes survival cycles through movement it chooses, not movement imposed upon it. Animals do this instinctively. Humans learn to interrupt it. Stillness is where the interruption ends. Breath changes next, not through technique, but through permission. The inhale deepens slightly. The exhale lengthens without intention. Pauses appear between breaths. These pauses are not breath holds. They are moments where the body realizes it does not need to pull in more oxygen or expel tension urgently. They are signals of metabolic safety. At this stage, many people feel an urge to interfere, to breathe properly, to optimize, to control. That urge is not wrong. It is a remnant of a survival strategy. But when acted upon too early, it overrides the very intelligence that is returning. Stillness teaches the body how to breathe for itself again. Culturally, this phase is deeply misunderstood. We live in systems that equate worth with output and aliveness with motion. In those systems, stillness is easily misread as stagnation, laziness, or depression. Historically, however, stillness held a different meaning. In contemplative traditions, stillness was not an end state. It was a threshold. In philosophy, it was the ground from which perception was clarified. In early medicine, it was recognized as the phase where the body reorganized after illness or shock. The problem is not that modern culture has forgotten stillness. It is that modern culture removed the context that made stillness safe. Volume 3 restores that context biologically, not morally. Another hallmark of thawing is nonlinear sensation. Warmth may appear in one part of the body, while numbness remains elsewhere. Emotion may flicker briefly, then disappear. Sensation may arrive without meaning, then retreat. This inconsistency is not regression, it is calibration. The nervous system does not reopen all channels, probes. It tests, it samples. This is neuroplasticity in action, the brain updating its predictions based on lived evidence, rather than instruction. When people panic at this stage, it is usually because they expect coherence too soon. But coherence comes later. First comes permission to feel without continuity. This is where stillness differs from collapse. Collapse is the body giving up. Stillness is the body standing down. Collapse feels heavy, foggy, and disconnected. Stillness feels quiet, neutral, sometimes flat, but present. The distinction is subtle, but it matters. Collapse drains energy. Stillness conserves it. Collapse dulls perception. Stillness sharpens it slowly. This is why some people report boredom or restlessness here. The system is no longer distracted by threat, but it has not yet reconnected to pleasure or meaning. The mind, accustomed to urgency, interprets this gap as emptiness. But the gap is not empty. It is unoccupied. From a mirror-linguistic hypothesis perspective, this is the body reclaiming the ineffable gap, not as a defensive pause between stimulus and response, but as space itself. Language does not rush in here. Meaning does not demand attention. The system is not preparing a narrative. It is resting inside sensation without instruction. Words feel intrusive in this phase, not because language is bad, but because language has not yet been invited back. This is important. Stillness is pre-linguistic. Trying to explain it too early reactivates cognitive dominance. The system tightens again, not dramatically, but enough to interrupt thawing. This is why many spiritual traditions emphasize silence, not as discipline, but as protection. Not protection from danger, protection from premature meaning. As thawing continues, posture begins to reorganize. Not better posture, more honest posture. The spine finds its own stacking. The head balances differently. Weight redistributes in the feet. The body stops leaning forward into anticipation or backwards into defense. These changes are often noticed only in hindsight. Someone realizes they no longer clench their hands while resting, or that they sit without bracing their abdomen, or that their gaze has softened. These are not habits being corrected. They are threat patterns dissolving. Philosophically, this phase marks a return from instrumental being to inhabited being. The body is no longer a vehicle for achieving outcomes. It becomes a place again. That shift alone can feel destabilizing. Many people have lived most of their lives relating to the body as something to manage, optimize, suppress, or ignore. When the body stops demanding management, identity can wobble. Who am I if I am not bracing? Who am I if nothing is required of me? Who am I if safety does not need to be earned? Stillness does not answer these questions. It makes space for them to stop being urgent. One of the quiet truths of this phase is that grief may appear, not sharply, but diffusely. Grief for how long the body stayed tense. Grief for how much was endured silently. Grief for the years spent overriding sensation to survive. This grief does not always carry images or stories. Sometimes it appears as heaviness, or a desire to lie down, or tears without narrative. These responses are not setbacks. They are acknowledgements. The body is recognizing what it carried. Importantly, thawing without movement means nothing ever moves. Micro-movements occur, subtle shifts, adjustments, and stretches that arise spontaneously. These movements are not exercises. They are the nervous system completing unfinished loops. The key is that movement emerges from stillness, not the other way around. This reverses the logic of urgency culture. This section ends with a reframe that will support everything that follows in Volume 3. Stillness is not inactivity. It is nervous system permission. Permission to stop scanning. Permission to stop performing. Permission to stop anticipating. From that permission, sensation can return safely. From sensation, trust can be rebuilt. From trust, orientation follows. But none of that can happen if stillness is rushed. In the next section, we'll ground this blueprint in lived experience, the quiet, often unsettling phase where nothing seems to happen. And that is the point. Field case study. When feeling returns without meaning, there is often an expectation that once pressure ends, relief will follow immediately. That once the relationship ends, the job stops, the crisis passes, or the system loosens its grip, the body will exhale into clarity. That insight will arrive. That peace will be obvious. That something will feel better in a way that can be named. But that is not what usually happens. What arrives first is sensation, unlabeled, unorganized, and strangely quiet. A person exits survival mode and waits for the signal that everything is okay now. Instead of relief, they notice a dull warmth in the chest that doesn't resolve into emotion, a heaviness in the limbs that isn't sadness, a flatness that doesn't feel numb, but doesn't feel alive either. There is no clear story attached. No insight arrives to explain it. This moment is often misinterpreted. From the outside, it can look like stagnation. From the inside, it can feel like confusion. The mind searches for explanation. Shouldn't I feel happier? Shouldn't something click? Why don't I know what this means yet? But the body is not failing to produce meaning. It is returning sensation before interpretation. This stage only appears when the system has begun to feel safe enough to register again. During survival, sensation is often suppressed, overridden, or redirected. The nervous system prioritizes function over accuracy. Signals that do not aid immediate action are muted. This is not dysfunction, it is protection. When the threat environment dissolves, the system does not instantly resume full perception. It tests. It allows sensation to return without committing to a narrative. This is why what emerges first often feels raw and ambiguous. In lived experience, this can be disorienting. The person may have imagined that safety would feel like joy or relief or certainty. Instead, they encounter a quiet presence without direction. They feel here, but are not oriented. There is sensation without context. This can feel unsettling precisely because modern conditioning teaches us that sensation must be explained to be valid. But sensation does not require explanation to be stabilizing. It requires time. The body speaks before the mind catches up. This is not metaphorical. Neurobiologically, sensory information enters the system through pathways that precede conscious interpretation. Interoceptive signals, changes in temperature, pressure, and internal movement, are registered long before they are assigned meaning. In survival states, the brain learns to suppress these signals unless they demand action. When safety returns, the suppression lifts gradually. The signals return, but the interpretive structures are still offline. This gap is not an error. It is the nervous system rebuilding trust. In this phase, many people attempt to rush meaning back in. They journal obsessively. They analyze every sensation. They seek frameworks, diagnoses, or spiritual interpretations. They ask, what does this mean? What am I processing? What is this about? These efforts are understandable. The mind is doing what it has always done to regain control. but premature meaning-making can destabilize this phase. When sensation is forced into narrative too early, the body learns that registering experience still leads to demand, still leads to evaluation, still leads to work. The system tightens again. This is why many people cycle here, feeling briefly, then returning to numbness, because sensation disappeared, but because it was interrupted. From the resonance matrix perspective, this stage represents a critical field shift. The environment has changed, but the internal predictive model has not yet been updated. The nervous system is sampling the field for evidence. Is it safe to feel without being required to act? Is it safe to notice without being asked to explain? If the answer remains yes, sensation stabilizes. If the answer becomes no, through pressure, expectation, or internal self-surveillance, sensation withdraws again. In lived terms, this looks like waiting. Waiting without urgency. Waiting without instruction. Waiting without a clear outcome. This waiting is deeply uncomfortable for people conditioned to equate movement with survival, but the body understands waiting differently. Waiting here is recalibration. One of the most common misreadings of this phase is boredom. The mind interprets the lack of stimulation as emptiness. But boredom is not the absence of sensation. It is the absence of urgency. When urgency drops, the mind loses its organizing principle. Without a threat to respond to or a task to complete, cognition floats. This can feel unsettling, even mildly anxious. But the body does not experience this as a problem. The body experiences it as rest. Another misreading is depression. People sometimes worry that this flatness means something is wrong, that they are stuck, that they should feel more. But depression is characterized by collapse, heaviness, and withdrawal from presence. This phase is different. There is presence without intensity, awareness without a storyline. It is quiet, not dead. Culturally, we have few models for this state. Most narratives of healing jump from crisis to clarity, from pain to insight, from breakdown to breakthrough. But the nervous system does not heal narratively. It heals procedurally, first safety, then sensation, then meaning, in that order. This is why this stage is stabilizing even when it feels confusing. The system is no longer reacting. It is no longer bracing. It is no longer scanning constantly for threats. That alone conserves enormous energy. People often report sleeping more deeply here, or needing more rest, or feeling tired without reason. This is not regression, it is recovery. Another hallmark of this phase is neutral sensation, not pleasure, not pain, just something. The weight of the body on a chair, the temperature of the room, the texture of clothing, the rhythm of breath. These sensations do not demand interpretation. They simply exist, and that is enough. This is where trust begins to rebuild. Not trust in others, not trust in meaning, but trust in being able to feel without consequence. That trust is foundational. Without it, later phases, discernment, boundary, and voice, become performative. They are enacted rather than embodied. Stillness without sensation is empty. Sensation without trust is overwhelming. This phase sits between the two. From the outside, it may look like nothing is happening. From the inside, the nervous system is relearning that presence does not require defense. That lesson cannot be taught cognitively. It must be lived repeatedly. This is why the field matters. If the person is surrounded by urgency, demand, or expectation, this phase becomes fragile. If they are constantly asked how they feel, what they're learning, what they're doing next, the body receives a contradictory signal. It learns, feeling still leads to pressure, and sensation recedes again. But when the field remains neutral, not intrusive, not interrogative, sensation strengthens. It becomes more distinct, more varied, more reliable. Only then does meaning begin to emerge naturally, not as an interpretation, as orientation. This section does not resolve sensation. It protects it. The next section will explore how language changes here, why words begin to feel unnecessary, and how the ineffable gap returns not as defense, but as space. For now, the reframe holds. Sensation without meaning is not emptiness. It is the body speaking before the mind interrupts, and that is not confusion. It is the earliest form of stability returning. Language and sensation, why words come later. There is often a moment, once sensation begins to return, when language feels suddenly excessive. Not wrong, not dangerous, just early. Words arrive with momentum. They want to organize, explain, and stabilize. They move quickly, pulling experience forward into shape. But sensation does not move that way. Sensation arrives slowly, diffusely, without agenda. And when language enters too soon, the body often responds by retreating again. This is not resistance. It is prioritization. The nervous system, having only just begun to feel safe enough to register experience, is not ready to translate that experience into narrative. It is still listening, still sampling, still checking whether presence will be allowed to remain unexamined. In this phase, language is not suppressed. It is simply secondary. Many people notice this shift instinctively. They find themselves less inclined to talk about what they're feeling, not because there is nothing there, but because naming feels like it might flatten something that is still forming. Conversations that once felt engaging now feel draining. Questions that invite explanation feel intrusive, even when asked kindly. This can be confusing. In a culture that equates articulation with awareness, silence is often misread as avoidance. But here silence is not withdrawal. It is containment. The body is holding experience internally, not to hide it, but to let it stabilize. From the perspective of the mirror-linguistic hypothesis, this makes sense. Language is not neutral. It shapes what it reflects. When a sensation is named, the nervous system does not simply label it. It reorganizes around the label. Attention narrows. Expectation forms. Memory begins to scaffold meaning around the word. This is powerful when the system is stable. It is disruptive when the system is still thawing. Sensation precedes language for a reason. It is the nervous system's first report, unedited, pre-narrative, free from interpretation. When language enters too quickly, it can overwrite the signal before it has been fully registered. This is why many people instinctively say, "I don't have words yet." That statement is not a lack. It is accuracy. In earlier phases of survival, language often functioned as a defense, explaining, justifying, and clarifying. These were ways to manage threat, avoid conflict, or maintain connection. Words were used to stabilize the environment. Now the environment is quieter. The body no longer needs to negotiate safety through explanation, and so language loosens its grip. This is not regression, it is reordering. The nervous system prioritizes signal over explanation when safety increases. This can feel unfamiliar, especially for people who have relied heavily on cognition to survive. For them, thinking was safety. Understanding was control. Language was the bridge back to equilibrium. Letting words come later can feel like letting go of competence. But what is actually happening is subtler. The system is allowing experience to exist without being immediately shaped into meaning. This is where the ineffable gap returns, not as a protective buffer, but as open space. In Volume 2, the ineffable gap was described as the space between stimulus and response where sovereignty resides. In survival, that gap is often collapsed or defended aggressively. Words are deployed quickly to manage the threat. Here, the gap reappears differently. There is sensation, then there is space, then eventually, there may be language. The gap is no longer something to protect. It no longer needs guarding. It exists because nothing is trying to cross it prematurely. This is why silence can feel right in this phase. Not forced silence, not withdrawal, but the natural quiet follows urgency. The nervous system is learning that experience does not require immediate output. That presence does not need explanation to be valid. That sensation can exist without being converted into insight, story, or identity. This learning is profoundly regulating. Talking too much during this phase can dampen sensation, not because words are harmful, but because they redirect attention outward too quickly. When a person begins explaining what they feel, their focus shifts from feeling to monitoring. They begin checking how the words land, whether they make sense, and whether they are accurate. The body senses the shift and responds accordingly. Signal softens. Attention moves upward. Sensation recedes. This is not failure. It is the nervous system conserving coherence. It is important to say, this phase is not anti-language. Language will return, but when it does, it will serve a different function. Instead of managing threats, it will reflect experience. Instead of stabilizing the field, it will articulate internal reference. That requires patience. Culturally, we have few spaces that honor this ordering. People are often asked to explain themselves long before they are ready, to articulate feelings they have only just begun to notice, to justify internal states before those states have stabilized. This pressure can push the nervous system back into defensive cognition, which is why in this phase, fewer words often feel right, not because nothing is happening, but because something important is. There is also a subtle humility here. Sensation reminds us that knowing does not begin with explanation. It begins with presence. Language is a powerful tool, but it is not the first one. The body speaks in gradients, rhythms, and shifts long before it speaks in sentences, honoring that order restores trust. In this phase, many people notice a preference for sensory communication over verbal communication. They may gravitate toward music, texture, movement, nature, or quiet companionship. Being with others without conversation feels nourishing. Shared silence feels connected. This is not avoidance of intimacy. It is a different form of it. The nervous system is learning to co-regulate without performance. From a neurobiological perspective, this makes sense. Language production recruits cortical networks that organize experience into linear sequences. Sensation, by contrast, is distributed. It is processed across multiple regions simultaneously. When sensation is dominant, the brain is operating in a more integrated, less hierarchical mode. Allowing sensation to lead temporarily supports this integration. Language will later emerge from a more coherent base. This is why attempts to process too early can feel destabilizing. Processing often implies resolution, but resolution has not yet formed. What is forming is capacity. Capacity to feel, capacity to stay, capacity to register without reacting. Words can wait. Sensation restores the gap by arriving before words, not to resist language, not to distrust meaning, but to ensure that when language returns, it reflects something real. In the next section, we will move into observation practice, exploring how staying present with sensation, without naming or fixing, supports neuroplastic recalibration and stabilizes internal reference. Observation practice, listening without translation. There is a subtle but important distinction between noticing And monitoring. Monitoring carries intention. It looks for outcomes. It checks whether something is happening, whether progress is being made, whether sensation is increasing, decreasing, or working. Noticing is quieter. Noticing does not ask sensation to perform. It does not demand clarity. It does not even require continuity. It simply allows what is present to be present, without interference. This section is not a practice in the sense most people are accustomed to. There is nothing to master, no posture to adopt, no rhythm to maintain. There is no correct duration, no benchmark for success. It is instead an invitation to step out of translation. When sensation returns after a period of numbness or survival, the nervous system is re-establishing trust with itself. That trust does not form through effort. It forms through consistency and non-interruption. Each time a sensation is allowed to arise without being named, analyzed, or redirected, the system receives a quiet confirmation. This signal is safe to have. That confirmation matters more than insight. Many people are surprised by how difficult it is to simply notice sensation without doing something with it. The mind reaches quickly for familiar habits. What is this? Why is it here? Is this anxiety? Is this healing? Should I breathe into it? Should I relax it? Should I pay attention or distract myself? These impulses are not mistakes. They are residues of earlier environments where sensation required management. But here management is unnecessary. From a neurobiological perspective, this shift is significant. When attention rests on sensation without interpretation, the brain is operating in a mode that supports interoceptive trust. Regions involved in bodily awareness integrate information without immediately routing it through evaluative or narrative networks. This allows signals to stabilize before being categorized. Over time, this changes the prediction. Instead of anticipating that sensation will require action, explanation, or correction, the nervous system learns that sensation can simply exist. This learning is neuroplastic. It rewrites expectation at a foundational level. Importantly, this kind of noticing does not amplify sensation. It often does the opposite. When sensation is not scrutinized, it tends to move, soften, or fade on its own, not because it is being controlled, but because the system no longer needs to hold it in place to be seen. This is one reason why people sometimes report that sensations seem to pass through more easily when left unnamed. The system is completing its loop. There is also a subtle dignity in this form of attention. It does not assume that sensation exists to teach a lesson. It does not extract meaning. It does not rush toward narrative. It treats sensation as sufficient in itself. That sufficiency is regulating. From the perspective of neuroception, this matters deeply. Neuroception is constantly scanning for threat, but also for permission. Permission to settle, permission to reduce vigilance, permission to stop bracing. When sensations are allowed without interpretation, the nervous system detects the absence of demand. There is no requirement to defend, perform, or explain. That absence itself is read as safety. Safety does not always feel warm or pleasant. Sometimes it feels neutral. Sometimes it feels quiet. Sometimes it feels like nothing much at all. And that is often where recalibration begins. This is why the invitation here is simple. Notice sensation, not intensely, not continuously, not with effort, just enough to register that something is present. If it moves, let it move. If it fades, let it fade. If it returns later, let it return. There is no need to follow it. There is no need to remember it. Resisting the urge to explain is often the hardest part. Explanation feels responsible. It feels adult. It feels like engagement. But explanation is not always appropriate. In early sensation, explanation can function as an interruption. This does not mean explanation is bad. It means timing matters. Psychologically, non-interpretive attention supports a shift from control-based awareness to allowance-based awareness. Control-based awareness asks, what should I do with this? Allowance-based awareness asks nothing. This shift reduces cognitive load. The mind relaxes its grip, and when the mind relaxes, the body often follows. There is no need to optimize this. Optimization reintroduces urgency. The moment you begin wondering whether you are noticing enough or correctly, the system is pulled back toward performance. That performance was once protective. It is no longer required. It may help to think of this not as a practice you do, but as a posture you stop enforcing. You stop translating. You stop converting sensation into information. You stop turning experience into material. What remains is presence. From a scientific perspective, this kind of non-directive attention has been associated with improved regulation, increased coherence between brain regions, and greater tolerance for internal states. But those outcomes are not the goal here. The goal is trust. Trust that the body can register experience without immediate supervision. Trust that sensation does not require correction to be valid. Trust that awareness can be quiet. This is why there are only 3 rules here, and they are not techniques, no meaning-making, no optimization, just noticing, and even those rules are gentle. If meaning-making happens, notice that too. If optimization creeps in, let it pass. Nothing needs to be fixed. Over time, this kind of listening does something subtle but profound. It restores a baseline sense of internal reliability. You begin to feel that the sensation can be trusted to arrive and depart without intervention. That awareness does not require narration to be real. That you do not need to stay ahead of your own experience. This is not insight. It is relief without collapse. In the next section, we will move into self-reflection, not to analyze sensation, but to gently orient toward what stillness and sensation make possible. Self-reflection prompt. There is no task in this section, no exercise to complete, no insight to extract, only a question, and the space to let it exist without demand. What sensations do I usually ignore to keep moving? This question is not asking you to search for an answer. It is not an invitation to scan your body or analyze your habits. It does not require memory, explanation, or justification. It is simply a doorway. For many people, movement became a form of protection long before it became a choice. Staying busy, staying productive, staying engaged. These were ways to avoid sensations that once felt unsafe, overwhelming, or inconvenient. This question does not ask you to stop moving. It does not ask you to confront anything. It only asks you to notice what tends to be bypassed when momentum takes over. You may notice a sensation immediately. You may notice nothing at all. You may notice resistance to the question itself. All of these are valid. If an answer begins to form, there is no need to hold on to it. If there are no answer forms, nothing is missing. This reflection is not about discovery. It is about orientation. Sometimes the most important contact happens not when something is named, but when something is allowed to remain unnamed, present without pressure. Let the question sit quietly. Let it pass if it wants to. There is nothing to do with it. The nervous system will take from it what it needs, in its own time. Integration sensation is not a problem to solve. One of the quiet legacies of survival is the belief that anything arising inside the body must mean something urgent. A sensation appears, and the reflex follows immediately. What is this? Why now? What should I do about it? This reflex is not wrong. It was learned in environments where sensation often did require response, where discomfort signaled danger, where internal shifts needed to be managed quickly to stay functional, acceptable, or safe. But as the nervous system begins to thaw, sensation changes role. It is no longer a warning system. It is no longer an instruction set. It is no longer a problem to solve. It becomes something quieter and more foundational. Orientation. Sensation is often confused with emotion, memory, or meaning because those layers tend to arrive soon after it. But they are not the same. Emotion organizes sensation into feeling states. Memory contextualizes sensation in time. Meaning assigns narrative and identity. Sensation itself does none of these things. It does not interpret. It does not explain. It does not demand action. It simply reports a warmth, a tightness, a heaviness, a lightness, a pulse, a pause. These are not messages to decode. They are coordinates. They tell the nervous system where it is, not what it should become. This is why sensation can feel unsettling at first. When survival was active, sensation often had to be overridden, ignored, interpreted quickly, and then dismissed. Action mattered more than accuracy. Movement mattered more than presence. Now, as urgency dissolves, sensation returns without agenda, and because it does not arrive with instructions, the mind may experience this as emptiness or confusion. But this is a misunderstanding. The absence of instruction does not mean the absence of signal. It means the signal is no longer about escape. Sensation does not exist to be understood. It exists to re-establish internal reference. This is a critical shift. Internal reference is the nervous system's ability to locate itself in the body, in space, in time, without needing external confirmation. When internal reference is intact, decisions become simpler, boundaries clearer, and responses more proportional, not because they are thought through better, but because they are felt sooner. Sensation is the first layer of that reference. In Volume 2, we explored how the body's signals can be overridden, distorted, or silenced by external pressure. Language, coercion, manipulation, and threat can train the nervous system to distrust its own inputs. Volume 3 reverses that trajectory, not by force, not by insight, but by permission. Permission for sensation to exist without justification. This is why it is important to release the idea that sensation must lead somewhere. It does not need to become emotional. It does not need to unlock memory. It does not need to produce clarity. If it does, that is fine. If it does not, nothing has failed. Sensation's primary function is not revelation. It is calibration. Calibration happens quietly. The nervous system updates its sense of safety, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through repeated experiences of non-interference. Each time sensation arises, and nothing bad happens, no correction, no suppression, no demand, the system recalibrates its expectations. This is neuroplastic learning at its most fundamental level. The brain learns, I can feel without consequence, and from that learning, stability grows. It is worth addressing a common misunderstanding here. Allowing sensation does not mean surrendering to it. Sensation is not instruction. A tight chest does not mean danger. A heaviness does not mean depression. A surge does not mean action is required. Those interpretations may come later, or they may not. In this phase, sensation is informational, not directive. This distinction matters because many people fear that if they allow sensation fully, they will be overwhelmed, incapacitated, or pulled backwards into old states. That fear belongs to earlier phases, when sensation was paired with threat. Now sensation is paired with safety. Not safety as comfort, but safety as absence of pressure. Sensation is not memory. It may echo memory. It may activate associated imagery or emotion, but sensation itself exists in the present moment. This is why returning to sensation can feel grounding, even when the content is uncomfortable. It anchors experience in the now, rather than pulling it into narrative time, and sensation is not emotion. Emotion gives sensation shape, color, and social meaning. Sensation alone is simpler, more elemental. This simplicity is not regression. It is a foundation. The core line of this integration holds quietly. You don't feel to understand, you feel to orient. Orientation is what allows the next phases of this volume to emerge naturally. Without sensation, discernment becomes intellectual. Without sensation, boundaries become rules. Without sensation, voice becomes performance. Sensation is what keeps the return to self embodied rather than conceptual. As this episode closes, sensation does not need to increase. It does not need to become clearer. It does not need to tell a story. If it is present at all, even faintly, that is enough. Stillness allowed capacity. Sensation restores orientation. And from that orientation, the next phase will emerge, not through effort, but through accuracy. In the next episode, we move into orientation, locating yourself in space and time, not by thinking about who you are, but by noticing where you are. Sensation is the body's way of saying, I am here again. But sensation alone is not yet stability. When feeling returns after a long period of override or survival, it can arrive without context. Warmth, tension, fluttering, heaviness, ease, these signals surface without explanation, without narrative, and without a map. For some people, this feels relieving. For others, it feels disorganized, not because something is wrong, but because sensation has outpaced orientation. Orientation is what comes next. Orientation is not meaning-making. It is not an interpretation. It is not insight. Orientation is the nervous system locating itself, here, now, in this body, in this moment, so that sensation does not need to shout to be noticed. Without orientation, sensation can feel overwhelming, not because it is intense, but because it is unanchored. The body begins to speak again, but the system does not yet know where it is listening from, and so signals may feel diffuse, confusing, or hard to place. Orientation provides that placement. It gives sensation edges. It gives a sensation of ground. It gives sensation time. When the nervous system knows where it is, feeling no longer has to scan for safety. It can settle into accuracy. It can become information rather than an interruption. This is why orientation follows sensation, not before it. In earlier phases of survival, orientation was external. The body learned to locate safety in schedules, roles, expectations, and responses from others. Internal location was less reliable than external cues. Movement mattered more than presence. Reaction mattered more than awareness. Now as the system comes back online, orientation returns inward, not as self-analysis, not as identity, but as a location. Where am I in my body right now? Where am I in space? Where am I in time? These are not philosophical questions. They are regulatory ones. Knowing where you are allows sensation to stabilize. It tells the nervous system that it no longer needs to guess, brace, or prepare. It restores context without demanding explanation. In the next episode, we will explore how orientation emerges naturally once sensation is allowed to exist without pressure, how the body begins to re-establish internal coordinates, how time slows enough to be felt, how space becomes something you occupy rather than navigate defensively. Orientation is not about becoming grounded as a concept. It is about becoming located as a body, and once the location returns, the nervous system no longer has to ask permission to exist. Thank you for entering this field of exploration. The resonance matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once sensation is allowed without urgency, perception begins to reorganize, not around certainty, but around presence. What was once overridden becomes available again, not to be solved, but to be trusted. You've been listening to the Resonance Matrix Volume 3, Silencing the Field, Return to Self Episode 2, Sensation, When the Body Speaks Again. I'm James Miller.